as is now quite customary in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung people down here in Victoria, about 2 hours to the southeast of Melbourne. And I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So moving on to the topic, yes, I was going to talk today about the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme that has been set up by the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand, or EIANZ for short. Before I get onto that, I was just going to talk a bit about some of the options around certification and what you might be trying to achieve through that. So let me try and get the presentation up first, and hopefully pick the right screen. So that showing up okay, Afira?
Yes, you can see.
Okay, good.
Yes, yes.
So what I wanted to start with was setting out what I see as being the problem. And this is sort of based on discussions with Greg Barber and others. So Pacific Islands, of course, do rely on a number of consultants to support their environmental and social work. And it's clearly important that the consultants you use do have the knowledge, the experience, the capabilities to do the work that you need to be done to the required quality. And that can be a bit hit and miss at times. At times you can end up with substandard work. And so the question is, well, is certification the answer to dealing with that? Now, if we look at the aim of how do we improve the quality of material that gets submitted to yourselves from consultants or other organisations, there's a number of ways we could look at to try and help to ensure that. Now, and this is not a complete list. I mean, there's other options as well. But I've listed some of those here, and I was going to go through each of those in turn. So if I start with the first, the very basic requirement could be simply to say that anybody submitting, say, an environmental document needs to be a member of a professional association in Australia and New Zealand. Well, that would be EIANZ. But there's New Zealand. There's a New Zealand Association for Impact Assessment, and there's, of course, a number of other organisations, including international organisations like IEMA, the International Environmental Management Association. I think I've got that right. And those associations generally have certain requirements for membership. So if it's an environmental organisation, you need to have an environment degree or environment-related degree. Often you need some years of experience to become a full member. In the case of EIANZ, that's 2 years before you initially can join as an associate member after you graduate. Then after 2 years, you become eligible to be a full member. And most organisations also require members to commit to a code of ethics or professional practice. So that gives some sort of basic checks, I guess, that anybody who is a member of those organisations and is preparing a document or doing some work does meet those requirements. The problem is that I think that's possibly better than nothing, but it doesn't ensure that the consultant, say, has the knowledge and experience they need for that particular work. So if I use, again, EIANZ as an example, it covers a broad range of environmental disciplines. So just because somebody is a member of EIANZ doesn't mean that they're necessarily proficient in impact assessment. They may work in another area of the environment. The other concern is that in some countries you may not have those professional organisations that someone can join, but there are at least those international organisations. A second approach, which is one that has been adopted in Fiji, is to maintain a list of accredited either individuals or companies. So this is where if an individual company needs to be on that list, there will be a process they have to go through. For Fiji, they have to fill out this form and submit that. That gets considered by the relevant government agency, and then they decide whether or not that person will be accredited and be put on their list. And you then need to be on that list to submit work. Now that can be quite effective because it does mean that you've been through that selection process. You've made sure that any consultants that are submitting work, they are accredited, they know, and you know what their skills are. The constraint of that is that you do need to maintain those lists, because if it's a company list, well, staff change within companies, and that can change the services that they are then able to offer, and it can also change how well they can offer those services. All you need is to have a few people leave a company, and potentially that can mean that they don't have a certain capability anymore. But the problem that we find in Australia is that with a few losses of staff, if they haven't been able to recruit new staff, they may still be able to do the work, but they're just not meeting timeframes, and things just get delayed because they are so short-staffed. So things can change, and that means you do need to keep those lists up to date. And I would think on something like a every 3 years or so. And reviewing this approach means that someone in government has to review each of these registration forms, and there is a fair bit of work in that. The Fijian form is fairly straightforward, but it does require you to provide project examples and referees. So even just the time to ring up referees and just check on their performance of those consultants, it could take a few hours of time. And for the consultants who are completing that form, I've had a quick look for the Fiji form, and my estimate to do it properly is that it would probably take me about 3 hours of work to complete that, which is fine if I expect to get if I do expect to get work in Fiji. If some 20 or more Pacific countries decide they're all going to have those accreditation schemes, and I've got to spend 3 hours in each one, then as a consultant, it's just it would be difficult to find the time to do that, because that of course is time that we can't charge for. So that can become a disincentive if you do have to do this in a number of countries. You then will have to decide, well, where am I most likely to get work, and I'll just get accredited in those countries. So that may discourage some new people coming in. The third approach is to actually set up a South Pacific certification scheme, or potentially just a country, but potentially a South Pacific scheme, and that could then enable that scheme to be more tailored to address the particular skills, the experience that you would be looking for the type of work that comes up. I guess my caution with that is to recognise that there is considerable work involved in actually setting that scheme up and then in operating a scheme. And I will talk more about this when I go through the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme. As I guess as an example, in Australia, we did have a couple of other organisations that were looked at setting up a certification scheme for site contamination. And EIANZ also had a scheme. The other organisations that operated for about a year or so, then they realised just how much work was involved, and they decided no, it wasn't going to be viable for them. And so in the end, it just went back to the EIANZ scheme, because initially they thought it was something that they could actually make some money out of. But as I say, I will talk more about that when I go for the CMVP scheme, the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme. The fourth approach could be to simply rely on existing schemes, and there's a couple I've mentioned: the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme, the Society for the Environment, have the Chartered Environmentalist certification, and there's a number of others around the world. So what you could simply require is that someone was a member of a certification scheme or had been certified in some way. That means that the cost is borne by that organisation, not by yourselves. So that's one advantage. Not all those schemes will be open to practitioners in the South Pacific. I did actually check that with the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme, and we don't actually restrict it to people in Australia or New Zealand. But anyway, but there's a number of schemes, and some are more rigorous than others. So some schemes can, as I say, can lack a bit of rigour here, and you may not be able to rely on them as much as others. And when you do rely on these other schemes, it doesn't mean that those people who are certified actually have an understanding of the context within the South Pacific. So that's one of the downsides. Now, the International Association for Impact Assessment, through some work that Josh Fothergill and Ross Marshall did back in 2017, did a survey of all the impact assessment recognition schemes around the world, and identified, as far as they could, all the some, I think from memory, I think there's some 70 schemes or so of different levels of complexity. So that's the report, which is available on the IAIA website. And they looked at how those schemes were set up. So there are quite a number of schemes around the world. In terms of the rigour, they assessed them against some criteria that came from the Institute on Credentialing Excellence. And these are what they saw as being some of the key requirements of a certification scheme. So clearly there needs to be a need for it, and there needs to be some value for the person getting certified in actually going through that process and getting certified, compared to those who haven't. And I'll mention this again later on, but that is one of the key drivers for certification. If our experience is that if there is no great advantage in getting certified, well, then you don't. Not surprisingly, you don't get a lot of interest in certification. And then objectivity, rigour, we mentioned. Ethics is an important part of certification, and including the certified environmental practitioner scheme. And you do need to have some sort of process to recertify people on a regular basis to just check that they're still meeting certain requirements. So these are the things that they saw as being important. And when Ross and Josh looked at these schemes around the world, yeah, some of these were covered off on all of those things, some only covered off on some. Yeah, and I just mentioned at the end there is an international standard which guides the certification schemes that, yeah, also, you know, ideally schemes would comply with that. A fifth approach is to use existing schemes, but to actually accredit it, and that could perhaps be through a spread. So, look, an example is a good example is the New South Wales government approach in Australia. So, the New South Wales government wanted to ensure that, wanted to improve the quality of the environmental assessment documents they were getting, and wanted to make sure that the people submitting those documents were appropriately qualified and experienced. So they looked at certification. They recognised that EIANZ had an existing scheme, and they decided, well, there's no point in duplicating that. They decided, well, yes, we can rely on that scheme, and in this case, it's the impact assessment specialist certification. We can rely on that to show that those people have the necessary skills in impact assessment. But we also want to, sorry, I'm moving on, getting onto the next slide. But on this one, so they accepted that, but they decided instead of them certifying individuals, that they would accredit various certification schemes as being adequate for their needs. So that then once that scheme was accredited, anybody who was certified through that scheme would then be recognised by the New South Wales government. So they developed these guidelines which set out how they would accredit schemes, and the EIANZ Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme was one of those that did get accredited. The other one was operated by the Planning Institute of Australia. And these are the sort of criteria they set out for those schemes. And then there's a web link down below for this document on the right. Now they then went a little bit further with that, and they decided, while we recognise that that these schemes will show that the individuals have the appropriate experience, have the appropriate skills to do impact assessment, we also want to make sure that they have some New South Wales experience and understand the New South Wales process. And so they set up this requirement to be that you would need to be a registered environmental assessment practitioner, or a REAP. So in addition to being certified through the accredited schemes, they added this additional requirement that says that you need to have relevant New South Wales experience, either as a project lead role in for at least three projects, or that you've worked on a project team and have engaged with New South Wales regulators on across at least four or more projects. So that's a very sort of quick check. It's one that we actually do through the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme as a first check to look at their New South Wales experience, and we see, yeah, okay, that's experience is adequate, and then we assess whether they meet the proficiencies as a impact assessment specialist. So that is one way of using the existing schemes, but potentially adding this additional requirement for perhaps to demonstrate some Pacific Island experience, before someone is then recognised. So now I'll move on to talk a bit more about the Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme, or CENVP. This was developed back in the 90s I did have a date there, so I've lost. It was in the early 90s, and there was a number of reasons for that. The Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand, EIANZ, itself was established back in 1987, and that came out as a recognition that environment was now developing as a profession in its own right, in the same way as engineering, architecture, and various other disciplines. So there was a need for environmental professionals to be seen as a profession and to get together in an organisation. And the MVP scheme came from that we had a profession, but it was also become more specialised. And so you weren't just an environment officer, you might be someone, an ecologist, impact assessment person, an environmental manager, and a regulator, and across a whole range of disciplines. From a community perspective, the community was also very much involved in looking at how our environment was being managed, how environmental projects were being assessed, and they were looking for greater accountability. During the 90s, there was also a bit of a problem with, or concern with, professional indemnity insurance became more and more expensive, and certification was a way to help to reduce those costs, and insurance organisations would take that into account in setting their premiums. And we did see some poor, examples of poor work and some unethical work. Not on a large scale, but enough that you only need a few things like that to affect the reputation of the whole profession. So it was important to the Institute to try and promote good environmental standards. So the CV scheme was set up, well, there we go, in 2004. It is a practitioner-led scheme, and I'll talk more about that. There's two levels of certification. We have a general certification that everybody needs, and then you can go on and get a specialist certification. And currently, we offer specialist certifications in those areas I've mentioned. And the social impact assessment one is under development at the moment and should be launched in the second half of this year. So the CVP scheme has its own board. The appeals process, there's a process that allows third parties to submit complaints about certified practitioners, and that's all done to, or it's all set up to comply with that international standard that I mentioned before. The approach relies primarily on assessment by a panel, which is generally a three-person made up of practitioners. But the final decision is made by the board. Just on the board, it has a separate board to EIANZ, and it was set up for that reason of making sure we comply with that international standard and to provide some independence from EIANZ. So EIANZ doesn't have an input on who gets certified and who doesn't. They have simply, it's set up under a bylaw made by EIANZ, and then the board operates independently from that. There is, it's open to any environmental professional, and we do offer discount for EIANZ members. And we do have a small paid administrative staff, just a few people, but it relies very heavily on volunteers. This one's a little bit wordy, but just quickly go through the certification process. So someone submits an application. The application will, no, so I'll cover that in a subsequent slide. But you'll be required to provide the CV, referee reports, work verification to show that this is the experience you had. The first step is that the CMVP office will review that documentation and just make sure that everything's there. And if all the documents are there, they'll then send it on to the registrar. And I'm one of the registrars for the Impact Assessment Specialist certification. So as registrar, our role is just to do a review of the documentation and to make sure that it's adequate for the panel to then do their assessment. So we don't recommend whether someone should be certified or not, but if we think it's if we think that the referee reports are not really good enough, or the examples of projects they provided are not really adequate to sort of show that they can meet the necessary criteria, then we will go back through the office to the applicant and say, look, we think you need to provide some more information on this, or do you have it? Or if not, well, then maybe just hold off and get a bit more experience. So, what I try and make sure is, as I say, that the information that then goes to the panel is enough for them to actually do their assessment and make a recommendation. So once it gets past me or the relevant registrar, it then goes to the panel, three-person panel, and they will review the application. They will interview the person. That generally takes about an hour, perhaps up to an hour and a half. They may speak to referees, and then they will prepare a report and a recommendation to go to the certification board. Initially that gets reviewed by this board application review committee, and then if they think it's all in order, it will then go to the board, to the CMVP board, for the final decision and ratification, and then the applicant will be notified. A couple of things about this. So the initial review, I mentioned the office, there are a small number of paid staff who will do that. The registrars are all volunteers, the panel members are all volunteers, and the board members are all volunteers. So you will see that this process relies almost entirely on volunteers. And that, what that does, it keeps the scheme viable. If we had to pay people for this work, the application costs would be just too high. So I think that's just the important point to consider. If you are looking at setting up a scheme, that there is this quite a bit of work involved. At the registrar screening stage, it can take me perhaps an hour or two to review applications. For the panel members, by the time they look over the application, they get ready for the interview, they do the interview, prepare the report, that could add up to about a day of their time for each of those three people. As I mentioned before, there is a complaints process, and you can go online and submit a complaint about any certified practitioner, and there is a process for dealing with those complaints. The particular requirements for general certification, you need to have an environment related degree, not necessarily a degree in environment, but something that has a substantial environmental component. You need to have 5 years of full-time equivalent experience, or the equivalent in part-time experience. You do have to sign a statement of ethical conduct, which means you have to declare whether you have been prosecuted for any sort of environmental crimes, but infractions, things. You also have to commit to meeting the code of practice on ethics and professional practice. you need to submit at least 2 referee reports and provide the name of a further person who is prepared to support your application, and provide supporting information around your, say, CV and perhaps other examples of your work. Then the other thing you have to show is that you are committed to professional development, and once you're certified, you have to get 100 points of professional development a year. Then there's a spreadsheet that shows how you get those points and how what points are allocated to different activities. So there could be things like attending conferences, seminars. It's personal studies recognised, services to organisations such as EIANZ, mentoring junior practitioners. So there's a number of ways you can get your professional development. Some of those things have maximum points that you can get against any one of those things. But you need to maintain those 100 points of professional development every 2 years. You have to submit your professional development log every 2 years, and that will be reviewed, and you can actually be audited against that. For the specialist certification requirements, most of them, the requirements for each one are slightly different to recognising the different disciplines. They generally require at least 10 years of experience overall in environmental practice. And I've made a typo here. That should say 5 years in the specialist area. So most require at least 5 years specifically in the area that you're seeking the certification in. And then you need to demonstrate your proficiency against certain specialist criteria. Now, that can be through in a number of ways, but most, the impact assessment specialist scheme requires you to submit at least 4 project examples and to answer some questions about your involvement in those projects. To show your proficiencies, you have to complete about 600-word essay against the listed proficiencies. And again, you have to submit referee reports. At least one of those has to be from somebody who is an experienced impact assessment practitioner. And for each of these specialist certifications, the CMVP scheme has established what's called a SEAC, a Specialist Environmental Advisory Committee, which has representation from consultants, from government, from industry, and sometimes academia. So people relevant to each of those specialist areas who provide advice about the further development of the scheme and the criteria that are used for each of the schemes. Just looking at the time, I don't want to spend too long on this, so I won't go through this in detail. I'm just using the impact assessment specialist scheme as an example, and these are the criteria or the proficiencies that people have to demonstrate. The first is to show that they have a good understanding of impact assessment methodology, including the things that I've here on the screen. The second one is that they have good analytical skills, which is very important in impact assessment. And here's the things that we would assess that against. Pause on that. I think all these slides will be available afterwards anyway, if you want to look at this in more detail. And the third criteria is around a set of interpersonal skills. Impact assessment is very much a process that involves needing to engage with the community, with a whole range of stakeholders in government and others. So, and to then put your findings across in a report. So you need both good oral and good written communication skills. So that's something else that we would assess against. As an overriding criteria, we expect that an impact assessment practitioner is capable of integrating leading and integrating multidisciplinary studies for quite complex assessments. Our experience with certification on the CNVP side, there's now over 1,000 certified practitioners, including a number of specialists certifications, mostly in the site contamination area, and an increasing number in impact assessments. Now, the reason why there's so many site contamination specialists is that about 2 years ago, most governments in Australia, the state governments, decided that put in a requirement that if you were submitting documents on site contamination to the environment protection authorities in those states, that you needed to be certified. So that obviously then resulted in a number of people wanting to get that specialist certification to be able to meet that requirement. And this gets back to what I mentioned before about the drivers for the schemes. There needs to be an advantage in being certified, and a clear advantage is when government starts requiring it. Now, once that happens, then people will get certified. If it's not something that's required, then for people who get certified, particularly consultants, they may see some marketing advantage in it, but that is based on their clients actually seeing the value in those schemes, and some do, and some may not be so aware of it. On the impact assessment side, the New South Wales government has, as of 1st of July this year, will now require all environmental assessment documents submitted to the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment under the environmental assessment process, that all those documents have to be signed off by a registered environmental assessment practitioner, the REAP that I mentioned before. And that has, with that deadline coming up, that has resulted in a lot more applications coming through in the last few months. So that number of 41 there is likely to increase quite significantly over the next few weeks. Next few months. I'm getting about 1 or 2 applications a week to review. So as I just mentioned, there is this increasing requirement in legislation from governments for people to be certified, and we're also seeing it at times in contracts that government agencies or others are wanting people submitting proposals to be certified. So that is helping to generating more interest in the scheme. One of the things we are seeing is that the governments are prepared to rely on the CNVP scheme, Certified Environmental Practitioner Scheme. So I mentioned New South Wales. Rather than setting up their own scheme, New South Wales and the other state governments have recognised that there is an existing scheme that they can work with, so there's no point in duplicating that. And we have tried to make sure we get government people onto those the advisory committees for the specialist certifications, so that if a scheme isn't quite meeting their needs, then they can provide that advice back, and we can look at how to revise the scheme so that it does give government what they need. Because we don't want governments having, or setting up separate schemes and then having sort of, two certification schemes going for the same thing in Australia. It just becomes difficult for practitioners, as well as becoming quite inefficient. But we are finding that governments are very supportive of the CMVP scheme. And then I did mention that we do rely heavily on volunteers, and it is the practitioners who develop the scheme and who, through those advisory committees and through the CMVP board, are still further developing the schemes and are taking that lead there, rather than it being just a government initiative. So getting back to the question, is certification the answer? Look, it can be. We do find that it does reduce the risk of receiving poor quality work. It's not an absolute guarantee. It's not. We can't absolutely guarantee that every certified person always produces good quality work, but it certainly reduces the risk. You would expect that overall the standard coming from the certified practitioners will be higher than if you didn't have that requirement in place. But I've made this point that it does require quite a lot of resources. There needs to be that rationale. It needs to be a reason for practitioners to get certified. I've talked about that. That IAI report does show that there's quite a lot of schemes around the world. And look, as a final point, the staff at the CMVP and myself and others, we're more than happy to discuss our experience with the scheme, with SPREP and with any other countries, if you were interested in talking about it further. So I can't answer the question about is it the answer for you. I think that's up to each of you, but hopefully that presentation gives you a bit more about some of the options and enables you to sort of think about what might be the best way of moving forward. And that's the website if you need more information, plus my contact details. And that's the company I work for. So my role with the CMVP scheme is purely voluntary as well. But that email address for the info at CMVP will take you to the office, and and our staff who will be able to respond to that. So thanks for your time. And with that, I will stop sharing, and we'll see if we do have a few questions, but I'll hand over back to Afira.
Thank you very much, Lachlan, for that excellent presentation. Very interesting indeed. We have some comments from our participants online, and the first one that we have here is from Galesi Tamata. The comment here is from the problems listed in your first slide on heavy reliance on private consultants. I feel that the government agencies or ministries would normally be expected to have much of the baseline information already from their field-related work and resource inventories, so some cost and time saving can be achieved here.
I certainly, there's capabilities within each of the country to do a whole range of work, and you of course don't rely entirely on consultants, but there are some all governments, including in Australia, New Zealand, do use consultants where they need certain specialist skills, where they not be able to do the work themselves, which generally because they may not have the skills, or they may not have the time is the other reason they use consultants. so the reason I listed that as a problem is that where you do use consultants, you obviously want them to provide the work to the quality that you are hoping for, and you want the work to address the need that you're trying to get met there. What I presented in terms of options is looking at how do you better ensure that the consultants you're using do produce work to the required standard. Well, I'll move on to the next question.
Sorry, I was cut off. There is an additional comment to that first comment from Mandria. She says, true, but not quite how it is on the ground, especially in the islands. However, it would be good to ensure baseline data are accessible or available for the assessments. That would also mean looking at developing relevant policies and regulations to support those standards.
Yeah, and this is something which I guess this is bigger, getting outside the topic of certification. One of the concerns across all countries is maintaining good baseline data, and there's been a lot of discussion within Australia about this. So at the moment, the Australian government is trialling an approach, a digital approach, with the Western Australian government, which so I'm just trying to think of the name of it, and it's around biodiversity data. But what they're trying to address is the concern that there's a lot of good information that gets collected in, particularly in work that might be done by consultants, but particularly in the impact assessment area, that consultants may go out and do some baseline studies. They put that into or summarize that in an environmental impact statement, but that data is not made more widely accessible. And what governments in Australia are keen to see, and I'm sure it would apply to all of you as well, is that data doesn't get lost, that it gets captured in some way, so that it builds up the whole database of information, within a country, and is accessible to others. So there are some sort of regulatory requirements around sort of data that gets collected. So, for example, I know in a number of states, if you're going out doing botanical surveys, that you need to provide information back to the relevant environment agency about your findings, and sometimes they even get you to provide samples of species you might have collected, partly to check identifications, but to get the data that you have collected. I think, as I say, I think this is outside the topic of certification, but it is something which is certainly the need to capture all the baseline data that gets collected is something that's recognised. It's definitely not in Australia and would be important in other countries. I'll send through to Vera others the website link for that Western Australian project. It's, yeah, which I'm not sure how, there's quite a bit of work in that. So I guess just recognise that, yeah, there's quite a bit of money, I suspect, going into that program, but it's being used as a trial to then develop across Australia. And I think from many of the stakeholders' perspectives, we would see that as being a great thing if that could happen, if you could actually go to one spot and find all the information you need.
Great, we'll do that. Thank you, Lachlan. We have another comment here from Rachel Marburg. She says, it would be good to understand how different certifications work together. For example, OHS and social certification as part of impact assessment. And this other comment here is also related to that one from Timothy. He says there should be a strong integration of health impacts in EIAs. We see that most environmental impacts have either direct and or indirect impacts on human health, but these are never captured in EIAs. Can the reviews please consider these?
Yeah. The certifications they're all separate, but if you go back and look at the criteria for the impact assessment specialist certification, there is a recognition that you need to be able to integrate with other disciplines. I mentioned we do have what we call an overriding requirement that you must demonstrate that you are able to integrate studies across a number of disciplines. That's really important to being an impact assessment specialist. Our social impact assessment people have been involved in a number of discussions over the last couple of years. So they were keen to see certification of social impact assessment practitioners. They initially looked at the impact assessment specialist certification, and we thought, well, could we get people certified through that? And we have had a couple of social impact assessment people certified as impact assessment specialists. But we sort of got to the point where we decided that there are particular skills, experience, capabilities involved in social impact assessment that make it a specialist area in itself. And so they've been working to develop their own certification. But where there is the interaction between different certifications, I guess that needs to be picked up in the criteria to show that you do recognise those links and you are capable of working with those other disciplines, in doing your work. And as I say, that is very much picked up in the impact assessment specialist criteria. The health impacts is something which is probably really not picked up so well. The health, I guess my observation I've been to a few of the International Association for Impact Assessment meetings, conferences. Went to a couple about 2007 was the first one I went to, and then 2008 was in Perth. And one of the things I found from that is that at that stage, that social impact assessment wasn't being particularly well addressed in impact assessment at that stage. I think it's come quite a long way since then. The social impact assessment people are still saying they still think that it's not as well addressed as it could be, and that's probably true. But there is much greater recognition of the need to deal with social impacts now than what there was some 15 years ago. But going to more recent impact IAIA conferences, my feeling is that health impact is in the same position that social impact assessment was about 15 years ago. I think it's not been picked up particularly well in impact assessment. it tends to be picked up in that piecemeal way of looking at, say, things like air quality and whether you comply with criteria that are set up to protect health, but picking up impacts on community health is not as addressed as well as it could be. So I think there's still a fair way to go on health impact assessment. Maybe we in our impact assessment criteria for specialists, maybe we need to give more recognition to it. I think that's something worth looking at. And maybe in a few years' time, the health impact assessment people might get together and get sufficiently organised to develop their own certification. But but I don't think we're at that point yet. But I think it is, it is starting to happen. So I think we are seeing more recognition of health impact assessment, of health impacts, but it's, in my view, we're still at that pretty early stage.
All right.
Thank
you for that, Lachlan. We're getting lots of questions now. Just getting down to a comment here from Margaret. She says certification scheme may not work in Pacific Islands, especially when there is a narrow pool of specialists. And then there's a question from Merpello. Is there merit for EIANZ to consider opening up a chapter certified practitioner scheme for Pacific Islands with proficiencies and standards adjusted to the Pacific context? It's very important.
Yeah,
that's a good question.
On the comment about it may not work in islands where there's a narrow, Pacific Islands where there's a narrow pool of specialists, that gets back to my comment, well, I guess what I've said a few times in the presentation, that the CMVP scheme does rely quite heavily on, very heavily, not quite, very heavily on volunteers. So if you go down that approach, then you need to have those volunteers available. And if you then move to specialist certifications, you need to have volunteers available who are specialists in that area. So when we first set up the impact assessment specialist certification, it was a little bit of a challenge to get our 3-person panels together because we didn't have anybody who was certified. Now that there's, so we just went out to people that we knew that, were very experienced impact assessment practitioners and tried to get them involved. Now that there's 41 people certified, then you've got that pool of people to draw on 4 panels. But with a number of New South Wales applications coming through, probably even that's being tested a bit. So that having access to volunteers to assist with those assessments can certainly be a constraint if you don't have that. About EIANZ opening up a chapter or a CMVP scheme, that's an interesting question. I guess I'll have to put that one on notice. And if there is interest from South Pacific in something like that, well, then we're certainly happy to discuss it within EIANZ.
Yeah, I think there will be a good a number of interested practitioners from the Pacific towards that request, Lachlan. That's now been officially requested here in this forum.
And I mentioned I did talk about the New South Wales scheme and how New South Wales is relying on the CMVP scheme, the Impact Assessment Specialist Certification, but they do have this additional requirement that you show you've got relevant New South Wales experience. That gets assessed by the registrar. So myself, and then there's one other impact assessment registrar. So we will look at the examples they've provided of New South Wales projects, and it doesn't take long for us to look over that. if we think, yeah, look, that shows that they clearly have got a pretty good understanding of the New South Wales system, we'll give it a tick, and then it'll move on to the panel to then look at the broader impact assessment specialist criteria. So, you know, it would not be that hard to have a similar requirement for people who are getting certified in the Pacific to show that they have got some Pacific Island experience.
Great. There's some questions here, Lachlan, related to that question. What's the process for Pacific Island countries to access the list of EIANZ certified practitioners? And there's one here from Lillian. Are there any EIANZ certified practitioners from the Pacific region so far?
I don't actually know if there are any, whether anybody who's a CMVP, being for that scheme, is in the Pacific. Certainly there would be people certified who live in Australia and New Zealand who work in the Pacific. But I couldn't tell you offhand. I can check, but I couldn't tell you offhand whether anybody's actually, you know, resident in a South Pacific country outside Australia and New Zealand. There are some, I know I've seen the statistics, and there are some people who are certified who do live overseas. Often that's because they may have worked in Australia and then moved overseas. The person who's the deputy chair of the advisory committee for the impact assessment specialist certification actually lives in Canada, but he worked in Australia for about probably nearly 10 years until his visa ran out. But there was a question before that. What was the what's the first question you asked?
What's the process for Pacific Island countries to access the list of EIANZ certified practitioners?
You can find the list on the cmvp.org website that it was on my last slide. So you can go to a directory there, and that shows all the people who've been certified, and including it shows which ones also have a specialist certification.
Okay. Here's another one from another question from Malachi. It asks, does EIANZ Merit considers us to work both Australia and New Zealand as an overseas impact assessment consultant? Granted, in brackets, is granted working visa, and also around the Pacific region. Is that your question, Malachi? Okay. Malachi, you can also ask directly if.
Now, what I actually meant is, if I'm registered as an EIA New Zealand certified environmentalist, can I work in New Zealand and Australia if I've been given the certified merit for this getting certified in the EIA New Zealand and also around the Pacific? Because most institutions now in Fiji, there's a clause that you need to be EIA New Zealand or Australian certified environmental. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like something that the Australian New Zealand government have certain requirements which EIANZ, of course, has no control over any sort of visas or things that requirements that the governments will put in place. exactly, Mary. Yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Like in Fiji, there's quite a lot of EIA certified, New Zealand certified professionals that are coming over to take over
Yeah.
some of the specialized jobs that Fiji, most of the Pacific environmentalists that don't have this international recognition like EIA for New Zealand and Australia.
Mhm.
But they are the one who've been lured to given the job rather than the local people back in Fiji, I mean, back in the Pacific Islands.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess that goes back to my point before about if you simply rely on existing schemes and say that, well, if you're certified, then you can work here. That is going to certainly going to discriminate against local people if there is no local certification scheme that they can go through. So, and clearly, you know, the best where local people can do the work, that's what should happen. So that was, I guess, my caution in putting a requirement that you must be certified would be to just make sure that local people do have access to a certification scheme. One of the things that these CVP scheme has talked about, and it's on their agenda, but they haven't got to yet. But that was developing some reciprocal arrangements, so that if you had been so recognising schemes in other countries, so that, for example, if you were registered in Fiji, if that scheme was recognised, then it would be seen as equivalent to CVP in Australia and New Zealand. And some of the other schemes like the Chartered Environmentalist that by Emma and others operate. So that is on their agenda, but they haven't got to yet. It's something they see as more of a longer term thing.
Yes, that's the same question from Amelia. She was asking, what is, if it exists, the process of accreditation of existing local certifications? Like Fiji have their EIA consultants registered with DOE, and we also have local institutions like Fiji Institute of Engineers, Fiji Institute of Environmental Health. So that's sort of like, that sort of ties into that as well.
Yeah, and I see Margaret's mentioned a certification in Samoa for major multi-year projects where specialists are selected based on qualification and experience of at least 5 years. So that's one that I wasn't aware of, and that wasn't picked up in that IAIA report. But sorry, getting back to that question. Yeah, the question was really about. So can we? Sorry, I was just looking for that question. What was the question again?
What is, if it exists, the process of accreditation of existing local certifications? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in terms of accreditation, so obviously, Fiji have their registration scheme, which would apply within Fiji. I guess it's a matter for other countries whether they might recognise that scheme. As I mentioned, CVP is looking at developing reciprocal arrangements with schemes in other countries, but hasn't got to that point yet. So, that might be one that gets recognition. And then if that does, then it would make it easier for, if the Fiji scheme was recognised as being equivalent to CMVP, and then that would make it easier for people who have been accredited through the Fiji scheme to then pick up work in Australia and New Zealand, because where there was that requirement for certification. So, so I think there is that process there is that opportunity for joint recognition of schemes, but from a CMVP perspective, they're not quite there yet.
Okay, thank you for that, Lachlan. There's a question here from Lavinia. She asks, what are some ways can you enforce or monitor the code of ethics among accredited consultants? This is another good question.
Yeah. When they renew every 2 years, they have to sign a statement saying that they will comply with the code. If there is that complaints process. So if anybody had a concern that a certified practitioner was not complying with the code, then they could submit a complaint. That would be investigated, and that could result in that certification being withdrawn. So it does. CVP itself doesn't do an audit or review of people's compliance with that code, because it'd be very difficult to do so. It really comes down to any concerns being raised about somebody's performance that would then lead to them being investigated. And as I say, there's a process set out for that, a committee that will deal with that, and that the result of that could be somebody has their certification taken away, potentially for a period of time, or potentially taken away entirely. I couldn't tell you how often that's happened, because it's obviously quite a confidential process. But EIANZ also has a process of dealing with complaints against members, and I do know that we have actually taken membership away from some people. Again, I couldn't tell you how many, but I know that it has happened, where EIANZ has become aware of unethical practice.
All right. Thank you for that, Lachlan. We have another question here from Marista. Does this scheme provide accreditation for different levels of EIA proficiency? For example, those who can fill up positions of international EIA practitioner and can work in the region and other countries, those who can work in the Pacific-wide region, and those who can only practice nationally, locally. I think we may have already touched on this as well previously.
Yeah. The answer is it doesn't. It's just there's just a single certification and criteria that most people would go through. The only exception is New South Wales that I talked about. That if you can operate in New South Wales, you can work on impact assessments without having that registered environmental assessment practitioner certification, but you can't sign off on a environmental impact statement and submit it to government. So every environmental assessment or every EIS that is done from the 1st of July has to be signed off by a registered environmental assessment practitioner, and they have to sign off on a declaration that says that it says a number of things, that basically the EIS has been prepared to a sufficient standard, and there's nothing's been that should have been left out has been left out. It meets the scoping guidelines, etc. It meets the requirements of the legislation. So every EIS has to be signed off by that person, but that doesn't, as I say, that doesn't prevent other people working on that document. It's only the requirement only relates to who actually signs off at the end on that. So that's the only one where that's the only sort of exception where having the impact assessment specialist certification wouldn't allow you to, without having that further that further recognition, wouldn't allow you to do that in New South Wales.
Right. Thank you for that. There's a comment from Margaret. She says EIA specialists from the Pacific Islands would have difficulty to practice in other countries like New Zealand and Australia because you need a good understanding of relevant laws, regulations, and policies that applies to their EIA process. Yes, that is correct.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Look, I would agree with that. That it does make it more difficult. But also the reverse applies. Australian, New Zealand practitioners would have the same difficulty in practicing within other Pacific countries if they didn't understand what the local laws, regulations, policies, etc. apply. And likewise within Australia, every state has a separate impact assessment legislation. So if you may be familiar with one state's requirements, but if you then have to work on a project in another state, or if you're trying to if you're bidding for a project in another state, you are certainly at a disadvantage if you can't show that you've got that experience within that state, and some understanding of how their system works. So yeah, look, I think that applies generally no matter where you practice.
Yes, I agree. There's a question from Bello. Can Pacific Islanders outside New Zealand and Australia apply for membership?
The advice I got from the CMVP office was that there is nothing to stop anybody applying to be a certified environmental practitioner if you so wanted to. You don't have to be an Australian or New Zealander. Now, if you for EIANZ, if you apply for membership of EIANZ, I think you would have to be an Australian or New Zealander, but I haven't actually checked that.
Okay.
So it does mean potentially you could use the CMVP scheme, but it would depend. But of course, you would have to consider whether the criteria within the scheme were applicable to your country. But that is an option.
I guess that's why we need that chapter here in the Pacific, Bello. There's a question here from Amin Yassi. Is the scheme also recognized outside the Pacific and Oceania countries? Is the scheme recognized?
Is that referring to the CMVP scheme?
Yes, I think that's what it is. Amin Yassi.
There's it's not recognized in an official way. I mentioned before that CMVP is looking at developing sort of reciprocal arrangements with other schemes. but that hasn't happened yet. So there's no formal recognition, but it is possible that say a government in another country, I mean, the fact that you have been certified, if I was a consultant putting in for work in that country, I don't think it would hurt that the fact that I have been certified, that that would help to sort of show that, you know, I'm hopefully a competent, you know, practitioner. So yeah, so while there's no formal recognition, you know, they may, you know, give some weight to that in deciding, you know, who gets some work.
Right. Okay, I think we have, oh, yes. I think that's about it with the questions from our chat box, because now we are at the end of our time as well. But I think the general feedback here from our participants is that there is a great need for a accreditation scheme in the Pacific, and the request is that we need your assistance, sir, to set that up for us.
Yeah, look, as I mentioned in that last slide, yeah, we're more than happy to continue that discussion, and I can put you in touch with our CMVP office.
And I'm certain also that most of our participants will volunteer as well to assist with the request. We'll gladly volunteer their time. All right, thank you very much, Lachlan, for that very interesting and helpful presentation. It's really opened up our minds, and also encourage us that there may be an opportunity to have a accreditation scheme for our Pacific practitioners. And so we thank you very much for taking your time to share with us today. And we again would like to request that you consider us in future discussions for in this area to really push our practitioners to become more recognized, and encourage us to continue practicing in this area in the Pacific, and also beyond that. And so we thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity, and we would also welcome any future trainings with your kind self in this area going forward. And with that, I would also like to thank you, to extend a thank you to all our participants for joining us today. We do have a training coming up next week, next Wednesday. That is in managing development risks and impacts on biodiversity and protected areas in the Pacific. That's our module 20. And that will be led by our World Bank presenters, and contribution by our USP presenter, Dr. Hilda. So that's another interesting training coming up. I would also like to remind you that our video and all the presentation materials will be available in our PNEA portal. You can access that information freely, so please do go and visit that portal. If you have any questions on how to register and get that information, just send us an email. And also another reminder, please fill in our online survey. This also links to getting your certificate. So very important that you do complete that evaluation survey. And before handing it over to Ms. Rachel, Lachlan, would you like to say any final words to our participants before we close our session?
No, just look, thanks everyone for coming along. So lovely to meet you all virtually. Yeah, look, we're happy to stay in touch and have some further discussions and see where this goes.
Great, thank you very much, sir. Handing it over to Ms. Rachel.
Thank you very much, Ophira. And Lachlan, thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing your experience and skills and helping us all understand the certification process better today. We really appreciate the time that you've spent with us, and clearly there's sort of interest and at the same time quite a lot of issues to sort of work through for the Pacific context, given its sort of small size, the small number of people working in this space, but also the skills that are really needed and valued and necessary to progress with good environment and social management across the Pacific. So a really excellent presentation. Thank you everybody for attending. It's excellent to see so many of you joining these sessions, and just to add my thanks to Ophira for her excellent facilitation and her reminders about the feedback. It's so important to us. It's how we build future sessions, and it's how we understand what you need. So it's really important for us to hear from you. So please do fill that in. And we look forward to seeing you next week at the session on biodiversity. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great week. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye from Samoa. Take care, stay safe, get vaccinated.